Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Safe House, brought to you by the SafeHouse Initiative. I'm Jeff Edwards, co-chair of the SafeHouse Initiative, and your host for today's podcast. In this episode, we peel back the onion on the critical arena of incident response in our 3-episode series, Prepare, Respond, and Fortify. We are extremely fortunate to have a true practitioner break everything down for us into easy to understand and actionable bits. Luke Emrich is the Director of Incident Response at Surefire and has spent the last 10 years in the trenches learning the best way to execute incident response. Welcome to the Safe House, Luke.
Jeff, thanks for having me today.
Yeah, it's great to have you. Could you share with our audience a bit about your background and how you landed on IR as your chosen profession?
Yeah, absolutely. It's an interesting story. I'll try to keep it short. If I rewind back to high school days, and I think that's where a lot of our paths start, I was class artist and grew up in a family that was very much middle class, but a great family, and was taught that I wanted to be able to prepare and provide for a family the same way that my parents were able to provide for me. And growing up in a small town in central New York and being exposed to what is art, I didn't feel that art was a good path to go. And the journey started with digital photography, believe it or not, and evolved into this world of, well, if my camera card dies, how do I recover the data from that? And I always kind of tinkered with computers. My grandfather was a ham radio operator, and had always had a computer from when I was a very young person. So I always looked up to him. So I kind of put those two pieces together. And a local school in the area had a program in digital forensics. So it was, as I was kind of coming out of high school, wanting to pursue art, but knowing that maybe that's not the greatest direction for being able to provide for my family, kind of used that to break into the technology world and computer forensics, and that's how I started in this direction. So, yeah, that's how I found myself in this space.
Yeah, so your passion drove your profession.
Correct.
Ultimately.
Yeah.
Interesting. Well, thanks for that. So a core foundation of incident response is preparation, really the subject of our podcast today. So let's just dive in. Luke, over to you.
Yeah, and I think that's a great place to start. And as we're working various different incident response engagements, I think that most of our clients are unfortunately in that position because there wasn't preparation done ahead of time. And you can prepare for the emergency by knowing what to do when that emergency happens. But I think we actually need to start sooner or focus in different areas. And 90% of the engagements that we get pulled into to investigate, in my opinion, it's the low-hanging fruit that the bad guys are exploiting in order to get into the organizations that they're targeting. So most recently, we're seeing organizations fall victim to not having, for example, multi-factor on their VPN, or a VPN vulnerability being exploited. If we rewind to previous events, the Microsoft Exchange on-prem servers were driving so much work for us for really like a year and a half. There was a series of vulnerabilities that kept impacting those systems. So I think there's a lot of basic housekeeping organizations can be doing to know what the threat landscape looks like, and just make sure they're not the last organization to fix that problem, right? As they're being identified.
So simple things you're saying, the most basic, just simple awareness potential.
Yeah, and it does come down a little bit to patch management. And I listened to the podcast, one of your podcasts yesterday, where you had James Hatcher on from Landsweeper, and he talked a lot in that episode about knowing what you have, and you can't secure what you don't know you have. And I think that that is so, so important, because if we don't know what we have in our environment, or we don't know what is exposed, how do we know what vulnerabilities to keep an eye out for,
Right.
to make sure that we're not the victim of those low-hanging fruit events?
Yeah. So when you look at, that makes a lot of sense. So when you look at preparation, getting prepared for incident response, is there a break? How do you break it down? Do you have like a planning phase, or how do you break it down? And how do you drill into those subsegments?
Yeah, so there's definitely many frameworks that we can look at in order to build a holistic security program. And I think part of preparation is that, right? So we're going to separate that portion of it. That portion is very, very important. But I think there is a purpose in performing exercises to go through an incident in a safe space and give you the opportunity to learn, where do we need to improve? What can we do better? And oftentimes this is done in the form of tabletop exercises. So what that means is coming up with a hypothetical scenario and bringing all of the business stakeholders together and running through that exercise. And this may be a exercise designed to mimic a ransomware attack. So that exercise might start with an end user identifying a ransom note on a file server. Now what? And we kind of go step by step through that exercise. At what point are we bringing in external parties, or calling your insurance company, calling legal counsel, bringing in forensics, crisis management, all of those types of things to really respond to the event, minimize business impact, and increase the or shorten the time to restore business operations, really.
So from a cyber incident response, do you get involved with the business continuity folks? Do they get involved, or is there lessons to be learned, or positive transference of good disciplines of tabletop tests or tabletop exercises into this arena, or do you get involved in those also?
Yeah, I think business continuity and backups is an incredibly important part of the process. Absolutely. And I think we've seen evolutions in ransomware, for example, where ransomware of the mid 2010s looked more like a malware infection. A user clicks on an email, visits a poisoned website, downloads ransomware, and affects that one computer system. And in that scenario, the ransom demand, I remember, they were usually 1 Bitcoin. And at that time, 1 Bitcoin cost something between $200 and $500. So you might have grandma download a piece of ransomware, execute it on her systems, and lost all of her family photos. And that may be worth grandma paying a couple $100 to get out of that issue that she's in. And I think that model worked for a long time. And I'm talking about an individual in this situation, but the same thing could happen to a business, right? But as ransomware evolves, we then see that organizations are implementing backup programs that is decreasing the success of their attack. So what does the bad guy do? What do the ransomware operators do? They shift their model to turn from a malware infection into a network intrusion. And as part of that network intrusion, they're going to try to identify the backup systems and destroy those. So that's an evolution that occurs. For the longest time, we didn't see any data theft, but in a way to combat organizations improving their backup programs and procedures, we see the threat actors shift their model to now stealing data and adding another layer of extortion to increase the likelihood that they're going to get paid at the end of the day. Back to your previous question, though, how does business continuity come into play? I had one client recently, And I don't know how. I've never run into this in my whole career. I've had many, many clients. I love when clients are in this scenario and they say, Luke, it's on the scoping call. We got hit with ransomware, but we have backups. And I'm like,
Mm-hmm.
fantastic. This
Mm-hmm.
gives us a path to restore from and gives us the opportunity to restore business operations. I had one client recently say, we not only have backups, but we have a DR site that we can switch everything over to immediately. And we're ready to do it right now. And we run a 24/7 business and we need to do that. And I
Mm-hmm.
said, hold on, guys, time out. We need to slow down because we don't now know how the bad guy got into that network. Great, we can cut it over and you can restore business operations, but there's nothing preventing them from doing what they had already done once you cut that switch over. So we still needed to do a bit of forensics and a bit of work to ensure that that environment that we were going to cut over to restore business operations in an expedited mode was safe and secure and wasn't vulnerable to get hit again.
So, as part of the preparation, do you take and step back and look at and assess what kind of how your position, what threats could exist for your organization? Because every organization is different and unique, and everybody's at different phases in terms of preparation or not prepared at all. Do you step back and say, okay, how do I assess a ransomware attack, or how, like not the tabletop itself, but the precursor to a tabletop exercise? Is that part of it? Say, here we're going to assess a potential risk. We're exposed here. Well, potential exposure here, and maybe it's ransomware, or maybe it's just a cyber intrusion, or maybe it's some other type of thing. Does that make any sense? My question.
Yeah, and I think it's a really, once again, goes back to knowing what you have in your environment and what your exposures are, right? And making sure that you have a program in place to remediate the vulnerabilities on those systems. Another piece of preparation that I saw quite a few organizations fall victim to is there have been a number of vulnerabilities. It's almost, at this point, it's been almost every VPN appliance that's out there. Not all of them, but many of them over the last couple years have faced a vulnerability that is exploited by the bad guys to in some way extract user credentials out of that system, or to be able to compromise or to guess user credentials.
Yeah.
So the organization says, okay, I determine that that system has this vulnerability. I'm going to go patch it and we're good to go, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's where we once again kind of need to say time out. No, we need to understand the nature of this vulnerability a little bit more, because the bad guy might have already enumerated your VPN passwords. And if you don't have multi-factor, which I advise all organizations have multi-factor on that VPN,
Right.
but if you don't, the bad guy may have those credentials, and all they need to do at that point is use those credentials and log in, and they look just like your normal expected user. Yeah, they may be coming from an IP address that you don't recognize, but that means you got to not only have the logs being sent somewhere else potentially, but also something or somebody looking at those logs. So
with all your, you're in the trenches with a lot of different clients over the years. You said something up front early that said, look, it's usually the simple things that are the gotchas, and that's probably a common phrase. But what about the ones that you find to be the most prepared that you've worked with, and still they have the gotchas that they didn't think about? Is there some common aspects there? What, maybe break it apart, saying, okay, here's what I saw was good. The good ones did this, but they were still missing these kind of things. Are there some commonalities there?
yeah, I think in the industry, we have started leaning heavily on technology like EDR. It's not a silver bullet. it's a tool that provides much greater protection if you didn't have it, but it's not 100% perfect. I have seen organizations get hit with ransomware even when they have some of these EDR products in place. And some of it is the bad guy getting crafty, right? They're enumerating what security products are running on certain systems, and they're trying to evade or not hit the systems or use the systems that have the EDR product. They're launching their internal attack from those systems that don't have it. So that's one aspect. But we've also done other investigations where the threat actor either didn't know the EDR product was in place or didn't care, right? There's one investigation that I'm thinking about where the threat actor exploited a specific vulnerability, was able to gain access to some remote desktop type environments, and almost immediately began stealing data. A couple weeks or months later, it was a bit of an extended period of time, the threat actor then reaches out to the organization and claims that they had stolen data. And the organization had got some tips on some things that they might need to look at from law enforcement that had also reached out to them. So it was actually a pretty straightforward exercise to jump into that EDR tool and do some searches. And it was the only activity associated with that particular tool in the whole environment. And the level of logging and visibility that the EDR product provided in that scenario gave us the exact command of the exact directories and file types that were targeted as part of this event. So yes, the organization was prepared. They're doing all of the right things. They had the security products in place. It did limit the nature and scope of the incident. And it also made it much, much easier to investigate. That was the type of event that could have turned into a full-blown encryption-based ransomware attack. But in that case was only a data theft event.
So if you take a look at the successful preparations, you document what the scenarios could be, you communicate those scenarios, and then you rehearse them with a tabletop exercise. Is that sort of the general gist? And that's through that process, you'll shake out where the holes are?
Yeah, it starts with developing that plan. I probably skipped over this earlier, but yes, it's about developing a plan and putting that plan in place. Many of these plans often also have kind of playbooks to follow, because not every incident or every event requires the need to engage external parties, right? So there's probably certain types of events that you identify, whether it's commodity malware on a computer system. What should the steps be taken? Does the organization have the capabilities to investigate or respond to that on their own? Or maybe even think about a compromise of an email account from that perspective. What's the organization's process if a user receives a phishing email and clicks the link? Do you have the capabilities to investigate on your own to say, did somebody actually log into the account? And is there a process in place where maybe we need to evaluate the individual's role? If this person doesn't handle any type of sensitive information and makes widgets all day long, is there a need to go further? I don't know. That's the organization's responsibility to figure out based on that program. But then, yes, going through and testing that plan with those tabletop exercises is a great process to put in place. And as I mentioned earlier, when you go through that exercise, you're likely going to identify areas for improvement. And it's on the organization to take action and either update their policies and procedures that they've put in place, or come up with additional measures to address those problems so you don't have those next time. Maybe there's a heated debate between, legal and HR on a certain topic. That's going to get in the way. Get that flushed out so you know how to react next time.
Yeah. So, how often do prepared companies do these type of tabletops? Annually, monthly? At some point it becomes onerous. It's overkill, but
Yeah,
it's
I would say, depending on the organization, somewhere between annually and biannually, or twice a
Mhm,
year and once a
mhm.
year, somewhere
Yeah.
in that range. And
Yeah. It's always a
to the
biannual thing. Is always gets me too. So, is it 2 years
yeah.
or every 6 months? Yeah. Thanks for the
um,
clarification.
the other thing, as the organization gets more mature, you could also bring in a red team or a purple team exercise where
Mhm.
you're not only practicing it on paper, but you're also creating a mock scenario using the technology in your environment and mimicking a defanged attack.
Mhm.
And how do you take the steps to investigate? Are we actually going to run some of the collection tools? Are we purposely going to build in gotchas that we run into, or that the tech team is going to run into, or the various different stakeholders are going to run into, to make sure that problems get flushed out?
Kind of like breaking into somebody's house at night, leaving a note says, "I was here. Lock your windows." Yeah, something like that.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
Kind of a creepy scenario, but it does bring it home. Well, this has been very interesting. So, Luke, do you have? It's always good at the Safe House Initiative to convey things that you can do today to be better prepared on your incident response. Do you have any final suggestions, thoughts, or guidance that you can share with us?
Yeah, when we're coming into any of our incident responses, we get a phone call from an insurance carrier or a law firm, a client directly, and says, "Hey, we've got an event and we would like to bring you in to investigate." We always do some open source research on what is exposed for
Hmm.
that organization. What's the low-hanging fruit? What would we want to potentially ask about investigating right off the jump? Do that yourself and do it
Mm,
regularly. What's
right.
what's out there? What is exposed? What are the systems that we are exposing, using sites like Shodan to plug in the public IP addresses of your environment and see what does Shodan tell you they can see, because the bad guys are using those tools to target you and target potential victims. If you can begin reducing that public exposure in any way,
Yeah. Yeah.
those are kind of some of the things that I think are probably a different approach than others are going to tell you, but are also going to have a big value.
Excellent. Well, Luke, thank you for such great insights and direction, and we look forward to our next episode, or Respond, which is our second out of our 3 episode series on incident response, prepare, respond, and fortify. That's our podcast for today. I'm Jeff Edwards for the Safe House Initiative. Thanks for joining us, and remember, be safe, be resilient, and be kind to each other. For more information on the Safe House Initiative, please use your mobile device to scan the QR code on the screen. Send us an email at safehouseinitiative.org@gmail.com, or visit us on our website, safehouseinitiative.org. We look forward to hearing from you.